Welcome to the History Maps podcast. We are looking at an empire that carved 1,796 unique celestial dancers into the walls of a single temple.
Right.
I mean, we are talking about a civilization that moved millions of sandstone blocks via canals, and they fit them together without a single drop of mortar.
Not a drop.
And they built these hydraulic reservoirs spanning 8 kilometers in length on a completely flat plain.
Yeah, it's a massive scale.
All while ordinary citizens lived in highly adapted wooden homes raised on stilts just to survive a relentless monsoon cycle. So we are setting out to conduct a comprehensive exploration of Khmer architecture, examining a building tradition that flourished from the 1st century through the height of the Khmer Empire and straight into the modern era.
And the sources for this deep dive provide a very detailed look into, well, the structural engineering, the spiritual cosmology, and the daily lived experience of the population.
Plus the ongoing conservation efforts of these historic sites today.
Exactly, because it is a scale of construction that really requires us to look beyond just the final visual product.
Right.
We are dealing with a society that quite literally engineered their religious and cosmological beliefs into the physical landscape. I mean, they manipulated water, earth, and stone to map their exact understanding of the universe onto the jungle floor.
Which is a huge undertaking. But to understand how these monuments map the cosmos, we first have to understand the literal earth from which they were built.
Yes, the raw materials.
Because the materials dictate everything about what is actually possible. Before they were carving thousands of dancers into stone, what were they actually building with?
Well, if we look at the early pre-Angkorian period, specifically around the 7th century at sites like Sambor Pre-Cook, they were primarily using fired clay bricks.
Just standard clay bricks.
Basically, yeah. The foundational building block of the early era was local clay. It was abundant and it was workable. They would extract the clay, mold it into rectangular bricks, and fire it at very high temperatures in kilns to harden it.
Okay, that makes sense.
And to hold these bricks together, the builders relied on a specific lime-based plaster derived from burning limestone or shells.
Let's break down that plaster for a second, because using a lime-based binder in a tropical environment seems like a highly specific choice. Why not just stack the bricks or use mud?
Because the environment there is entirely unforgiving. You are dealing with intense heat, massive humidity, and these seasonal deluges of rain.
So mud would just wash right away.
Exactly. Mud simply washes away in a monsoon. So the lime-based plaster provided crucial chemical adhesion to keep the structure standing.
Right.
But it served a second, equally important function. You see, a fired clay brick has a very coarse, porous surface.
It's got texture.
Right, and that makes it highly susceptible to weathering. Those microscopic crevices are the perfect anchor points for seeds. In a tropical climate, vegetation growth will literally tear a brick building apart piece by piece.
So they needed to seal the building.
Precisely. They applied a thick stucco overlay, primarily made from that same lime mixture, over the entire brick structure. This provided a smooth, protective shell.
And I'd imagine you can't easily carve intricate details into a coarse, brittle brick without it shattering, right?
No, you can't. So the soft stucco was where they actually executed their art. Before the stucco fully cured, artisans would sculpt their motifs directly into it.
Like what kind of motifs?
Intricate floral patterns, mythological scenes, celestial figures, all of that was in the stucco, not the brick.
That makes perfect sense for smaller early structures. But as the empire expanded and their ambitions grew, they started building these massive, multi-tiered monuments.
Yeah, their scale shifted drastically.
And a brick and stucco wall cannot support a towering mountain of stone, especially in a region that is essentially a giant floodplain.
You hit on the primary engineering constraint of the entire region right there, the water table.
Right, because of the lake.
Exactly. The region surrounding the Tunnel Sap Lake has a very high water table, which poses a massive structural threat to heavy monuments. If you try to build a towering solid pyramid on wet, shifting clay, the sheer weight of it will cause the ground to compress unevenly.
So the structure will just sink.
It will sink, tilt, or outright collapse. They needed material that could solve the foundation problem, which brings us to laterite.
Let's focus on laterite because the physical properties of this material feel almost like a cheat code for ancient builders.
It really is unique.
Laterite is essentially a soil type, right? Like a porous clay that is very rich in iron and aluminum.
Yes. It is formed through the intense tropical weathering of the underlying rocks. Heavy rains wash away the more soluble minerals, leaving the iron and aluminum oxides behind.
And the extraction process is where the true utility of laterite becomes apparent. When laborers dig laterite out of the wet earth, it is incredibly soft and malleable.
Right. It has a very high moisture content underground.
So you can cut it into large, precise rectangular blocks quite easily using simple iron spades or cutting tools.
You can. But, as you pointed out earlier, you cannot build a massive foundation out of soft clay.
Right, that defeats the purpose.
Exactly. And that is where the chemistry takes over. Once you extract that soft block and expose it to the tropical sun and the open air, a chemical reaction occurs.
The moisture evaporates.
Yes, the moisture evaporates, the iron and aluminum oxides crystallize, and the block cures. It hardens into a highly durable, rigid, weather-resistant stone.
So they are essentially mining a soft paste that bakes itself into solid rock just by sitting outside.
Precisely. And its utility goes beyond just being hard. Remember the high water table?
Yeah.
Laterite is highly porous. It looks almost like a rigid metallic sponge. When the monsoon rains arrive and the ground becomes saturated, a laterite foundation does not repel the water and shift.
Wait, it absorbs it.
It actually absorbs the water. The material breathes with the moisture of the earth, which stabilizes the massive weight above it.
That is a highly functional adaptation.
It is. Because of this compressive strength and stability, the Khmer builders used laterite extensively for the hidden foundations, the inner cores of the thick walls, and the massive stepped terraces. It provided the solid, elevated platforms necessary to support the immense weight of the structures.
But there is a catch. Because laterite has that pitted, coarse, sponge-like surface, it is terribly ugly.
It is not a decorative stone, no.
You cannot carve a delicate smiling face or a floral motif into a rock full of holes. So while laterite did the heavy lifting, the builders turned to sandstone for the visible surfaces.
Right. Sandstone is the aesthetic triumph of Khmer architecture. Specifically, they favored a gray and yellowish-brown variety.
And why this specific sandstone?
This sandstone was fine-grained enough to take microscopic, precise carving without shattering, yet durable enough to withstand the centuries. However, there was a major logistical issue.
It wasn't local.
Exactly. The sandstone was not local to the immediate floodplains where they were building. It was sourced from massive quarries at the foot of Mount Meru, located roughly 30 to 40 kilometers away from the primary construction sites.
We need to pause and look at the logistics of this because it is staggering. We are not talking about a few decorative statues. They needed millions of massive sandstone blocks to face these temples.
The millions of them.
You cannot drag millions of heavy stone blocks 40 kilometers through dense jungle mud using oxen.
No, you cannot. So they altered the landscape. They engineered an extensive network of canals linking the quarries at Mount Meru directly to the construction sites.
So they are floating the stone.
Yes.
Yep.
They would load these massive, precisely cut sandstone blocks onto wooden barges or bamboo rafts at the quarry and float them down the canal network, utilizing the natural flow of water and gravity.
That is a massive coordination effort.
The logistics of coordinating the quarrying, the loading, the navigation of the canals, and the precise delivery timing at the construction site represent an administrative mastery that rivals the stonework itself.
And when that stone finally arrived, the stonemasons faced another massive hurdle. They assembled these blocks without any adhesive.
Right. No lime plaster, no mortar, nothing.
Just dry stone on stone. How do you stack millions of stones up to 60 meters in the air and ensure the building does not just slide apart during a heavy storm?
They achieve stability through extreme precision and friction. When two sandstone blocks needed to be joined, the masons would literally suspend one block over the other and grind the surfaces together.
Grind them, like, against each other.
Yes, they would rub the two massive stones against one another back and forth until every microscopic imperfection was smoothed out and the joint was perfectly flush.
So they're using the stone itself as sandpaper to create a vacuum-tight seal.
Exactly. The sheer weight of the stone, combined with the friction of a perfectly flush joint, held the structures together. You cannot even slide a sheet of paper between the joints of the finest Khmer stonework.
That is incredibly precise.
And in critical structural areas where they needed extra tensile strength, like at the corners of a massive enclosure wall or where long galleries intersected, they developed a hidden reinforcement technique.
What did they do?
They would carve matching channels into the top surfaces of two adjoining stones. Then they would insert cast iron rods into those channels and pour molten lead over them.
To lock them.
Right. When the lead cooled and expanded, it locked the stones together with an unbreakable iron clamp, entirely hidden from the outside.
Let's visualize this entire construction process playing out simultaneously across the landscape, because it is a massive industrial operation.
Oh, absolutely.
You have one workforce in the muddy trenches, extracting this soft red laterite, cutting it like cheese, and laying it out to bake and harden in the sun. Meanwhile, 40 kilometers away, teams are carving sandstone out of a mountain, loading it onto barges, and floating it down a custom-built river.
And when those blocks arrive.
Yeah, another team of masons is suspending them from wooden scaffolds, rubbing them together to create a seamless fit, while someone else is pouring molten metal into the corners.
And we must also mention how they handled the roofs. They utilize a structural technique called the corbelled arch. This is distinct from a true Roman arch.
Let's clarify the difference, because that mechanical distinction dictates what the insides of these temples actually felt like.
It does.
A true Roman arch relies on a central keystone at the very top. The keystone locks the arch, taking all the downward weight and distributing it outward along the curve, directing the force down into the pillars. It allows for wide, sweeping, open interior spaces.
Right. But the Khmer builders did not use the keystone method. Instead, they used the corbelled arch, which is essentially a cantilever system.
How does that work in practice?
To create a vaulted ceiling over a corridor, they would stack stones on either side of the wall. With each successive upward layer, they would offset the stone so that it overhung the one below it just a fraction of an inch, stepping inward toward the center.
It is like taking 2 stacks of heavy books on a table and slowly sliding the top books closer and closer together until they touch in the middle over the empty space.
That is a perfect analogy. You step the stones inward until the gap at the top is narrow enough to be closed by a single capstone.
But there is a limitation to that, right?
A severe limitation. The corbelled arch relies entirely on the massive weight of the walls pulling downward to counter the inward tipping of the overhanging stones. Because of this physics constraint, a corbelled arch cannot span a wide distance.
So it's too wide.
If the gap is too wide, the overhanging stones will simply tip over and fall.
Which means the interior reams and galleries of these massive temples are actually quite narrow and dark. You might have a building that is 200 feet wide on the outside, but the internal corridors are only a few meters across because that is the physical limit of the corbelled arch spanning the ceiling.
Exactly. The engineering dictated the spatial reality.
Yeah.
But to summarize their mastery of materials,
Right.
let's look at how they combined them.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this with a modern comparison.
Poet?
The laterite is functioning exactly like the structural steel framework of a modern skyscraper. It is entirely essential for the building to stand up on soft ground. It handles all the massive compressive force, but it is completely hidden from view deep inside the walls.
Very true.
And the sandstone acts as the expensive aesthetic glass facade that everyone actually looks at and admires. You need both, but they serve entirely different masters.
A very precise way to look at it. The laterite ensures survival against the earth and the water. The sandstone ensures the communication of meaning. And once the builders mastered these materials, they did not just build shelters or civic centers. They began organizing these stones to reflect their most deeply held spiritual beliefs, leading to the defining form of Khmer design.
Which takes us into the pre-Angkorian origins and the evolution of what is known as the Temple Mountain. So they've mastered this waterproof stone and this detailed sandstone, but you don't go through all that trouble just to build a simple monument.
No, you don't.
You do it because you believe you are divine, and you need a house that proves it to everyone who looks at it. Let's look at how that belief actually shaped the blueprints.
Okay.
If we trace the chronology from the early Funan and Chenla kingdoms, spanning the 1st to the 8th centuries, we see the early foundations of these ideas. But the pivotal moment occurs in the year 802, when King Jayavarman II establishes something called the Theravada cult.
The establishment of the Theravada cult was a calculated fusion of political theology and architecture. Theravada translates roughly to the god-king cult.
So a god king.
Right. Prior to this, kings certainly held power, but Jayavarman II elevated the monarchy to a cosmological absolute. By identifying the king as a divine incarnation on earth, specifically associated with the Hindu god Shiva, the ruling monarch legitimized his absolute authority over the state, the land, and the people.
So he is no longer just the guy with the biggest army. He is literally a god walking among mortals.
Yes, and when the political reality changes that drastically, the architecture must evolve to reflect it. The state temple was no longer just a place for priests to worship the gods in the abstract. It became the physical locus of the king's deified essence.
The building itself was proof of his divinity.
The building was the proof.
And the ultimate architectural expression of that proof is the Temple Mountain. This design is not just a tall building, it is a physical stone representation of Mount Meru.
Yes, Mount Meru.
In both Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, Mount Meru is the cosmic axis. It is the center of the universe, the dwelling place of the gods. The Khmer architects literally tried to build the center of the universe on the Cambodian floodplain, and the geometry they used to achieve this is incredibly specific and rigid.
Every single element of the Temple Mountain maps directly to the cosmology. You start with a tiered stepped pyramid base. These ascending tiers represent the hierarchical ascent from the earthly realm up to the divine realm.
A physical staircase to heaven.
It is a physical staircase to heaven.
Oh.
And at the very top of this pyramid, you have a quincunx of 5 towers.
A quincunx being the arrangement of 5 points, exactly like the 5 dots on a 6-sided die. One central spire surrounded by 4 subsidiary towers at the corners.
Correct. Those 5 towers represent the 5 peaks of Mount Meru. But the symbolism extends outward from that central peak.
How so?
Well, Mount Meru is described as being surrounded by rings of mountains and vast oceans. The architects mirrored this by building massive, concentric enclosure walls around the pyramid to represent the surrounding mountain chains.
Oh, I see.
And finally, they dug massive water moats that enclosed the entire complex, which physically represented the cosmic ocean surrounding the universe.
So they are building a literal scale model of reality as they understood it. And this structure served a dual purpose. First, it was the terrestrial dwelling place of the gods, bringing their celestial power down to earth.
Right.
Second, it was the monument that validated the king's role as the universal ruler. He is the mediator between heaven and earth, and he possesses the architectural key to the cosmos.
We can track the evolution of this ambition through the surviving monuments. For example, the Bakong,
Okay, the Bakong.
which was consecrated in the year 881 by King Indravarman I. It is considered the earliest surviving example of a fully realized temple mountain. It features a massive 5-tiered laterite pyramid that acts as the base, supporting a central shrine at the summit. It really established the template.
Then, just a few decades later, in the year 906, King Yasovarman I builds Phom Bakeng. And he introduces a new tactic.
He does.
Instead of just building a pyramid on the flat plain, he positions his temple mountain on top of a natural existing hill. He uses the geological landscape itself to elevate the structure, making the ascent to the 5 towers even more pronounced and visually dominant over the surrounding area.
He was utilizing the earth to amplify the theology. And this drive for vertical dominance reaches an extreme later under King Jayavarman IV.
What did he do differently?
He temporarily moves the capital away from the traditional Angkor area to a remote site called Kokher. There we see the construction of massive corbelled prangs or towers. The primary pyramid at Kokher is incredibly steep, prioritizing an extreme, almost intimidating verticality over the balanced symmetry of the earlier temples.
The progression shows this relentless ambition. Every time a new sovereign takes the throne, he is essentially obligated by the Theravada cult to build his own temple mountain.
Yes, to cement his power.
He has to establish his own center of the universe to prove his legitimacy. But looking at the steepness of these structures and considering what we discussed about the narrowness of those corbelled stone corridors, it brings up a crucial point about the human experience of these spaces.
Which is often misunderstood, yes.
Right. Were these grand temple mountains actually functional spaces for the population? If I'm an ordinary rice farmer in the 10th century, am I going inside the Temple Mountain on a Tuesday to pray, like a peasant going into a medieval Catholic cathedral?
The structural evidence strongly points to the contrary. These were absolutely not congregational spaces designed for mass public worship.
Why not? They're a massive structure.
They're massive on the outside, but structurally prohibitive on the inside. First, look at the stairs leading up the pyramids. The steps are incredibly steep, often with treads so narrow that you have to turn your foot sideways to climb them.
Just to physically fit on the step.
Yes. It requires a physical bowing of the body, a deliberate posture of submission just to ascend. Second, as we establish, the corbelled arch technique means the galleries and internal sanctuaries are dark, narrow, and entirely unsuited for large gatherings. The architecture is explicitly designed to exclude the masses.
So the inner sanctum is a restricted zone.
Highly restricted. The innermost areas, particularly the central shrine at the peak, were likely reserved solely for the king and the high priests, who performed the vital maintenance rituals of the cosmos.
That makes sense.
The architecture demonstrated the hierarchy of the universe visually to the commoners from the outside. The public interacted with the temple through the vast economic resources it commanded, the agricultural systems it managed, and the sheer visual dominance it held over the skyline. They knew the gods were inside, but they were not invited in to see them.
That context, the exclusivity, the mastery of sandstone, the cosmological mapping, makes the culmination of this style even more striking. The principles of the Temple Mountain reached their absolute zenith in the 12th century under King Suryavarman II.
Yes, the peak of the empire.
This brings us to Angkor Wat, a structure that unified astronomy, religion, engineering, and political power into a single complex that is just formidable.
Angkor Wat is undeniably the defining achievement of Khmer architecture. It is built upon the Pancharatna concept.
Which is what...
It's a specific architectural layout that actually has its roots in Buddhist monasteries from the year 500 in India. Pancharatna translates to 5 jewels, and in this context, it refers to the quincunx layout we discussed, a central shrine surrounded by 4 subsidiary shrines at the corners, creating that 5-peaked mountain profile.
The scale of Angkor Wat is difficult to accurately convey with numbers alone.
It really is.
It is surrounded by a rectangular moat that is roughly 200 meters wide. That is as wide as 2 football fields laid end to end just for the water barrier.
Right.
The moat encloses an area of roughly 400 acres. Within that massive island, you have 3 progressively elevated rectangular galleries, drawing the eye and the visitor upward and inward, finally culminating in the central quincunx of towers, with the main tower rising 65 meters above the ground.
But despite adhering perfectly to the layout of a temple mountain representing Mount Meru, Angkor Wat fundamentally breaks a major rule of Khmer architectural orientation.
This is where the specific choices of the builder get truly fascinating. Almost all Khmer temples face east.
Right.
East is the direction of the rising sun. It symbolizes genesis, renewal, and the dawn of a new cosmic cycle. You enter from the east, and you move west into the sanctuary. Angkor Wat, however, faces west.
It does.
The primary entrance, the massive causeway crossing the moat, all of it is oriented toward the setting sun. The sources offer a few theories for this radical departure.
The first theory is theological. The temple was dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu. Unlike Shiva, who is the focus of earlier state temples, Vishnu is the god of preservation.
Okay.
In Hindu cosmology, Vishnu is traditionally associated with the western direction. By orienting the temple west, Suryavarman II was physically aligning his monument with his chosen patron deity.
But the other theory, which carries a lot of weight in the sources, is that Suryavarman II intended Angkor Wat to be his own mausoleum. He was building his tomb while he was still alive.
And the funerary theory is heavily supported by the internal artwork and the flow of the architecture itself. When you walk through the outer galleries and view the extensive, continuous bas-relief carvings, the narrative dictates how you move through the space.
Meaning the images force you to walk a certain way?
Yes, the carvings flow in a counterclockwise direction.
Why does the direction of a carving matter?
Because in traditional Hindu practices, counterclockwise circumambulation, walking around a sacred object with your left shoulder toward it, is a ritual practice specifically associated with funerary rites and the realm of the dead.
Ah.
Normal celebratory worship is conducted clockwise. If you combine the Western orientation, facing the setting sun, with the counterclockwise funerary flow of the artwork, the argument that Angkor Wat functioned as a royal tomb as well as a state temple becomes incredibly strong.
So he is building a monument that honors Vishnu, preserves the cosmos, and houses his own remains. But the precision of the engineering does not stop at the stone walls. It extends directly into the sky. Angkor Wat is essentially a massive stone celestial calendar.
Yes, the astronomical alignments.
The architects designed the building to align perfectly with astronomical events.
The most famous example of this is the spring equinox. On the day of the spring equinox, if you stand at the center of the western entrance causeway, the architecture frames the sky. The sun rises perfectly over the exact pinnacle of the central tower. It spears the monument.
They engineered the sightline so that the building tracks the cycles of the sun and the moon. They are effectively tying the physical structure of the king's monument to the continuous maintenance of cosmic balance.
It's a literal timekeeping device.
It's like they were trying to physically trap time inside the masonry. Every single measurement, every courtyard dimension, every step corresponds to Hindu cosmological numbers, measuring out vast epochs of mythic time in units of stone.
That celestial alignment emphasizes the temple's role as the axis mundi, the central pillar that connects heaven, earth, and the underworld. And to communicate those myths, they utilized an unparalleled level of artistry. You have nearly 1,000 square meters of continual bas-relief carvings covering the gallery walls.
Let's look closely at those bas-reliefs because they aren't just decorative patterns. They depict massive, violent mythological epics.
Very dynamic scenes.
The most famous section depicts the churning of the ocean of milk. This is a core Hindu creation myth. To explain it simply, you have a giant cosmic ocean, and buried deep within it is the elixir of immortality. To extract this elixir, the gods and the demons, who are usually at war, have to call a truce.
Right.
They take a giant, multi-headed serpent, a naga, and wrap it around a central mountain. The gods grab the tail, the demons grab the head, and they engage in a cosmic, centuries-long tug-of-war, pulling the serpent back and forth to literally churn the ocean into milk to release the elixir.
And the artisans at Angkor Wat carved this entire sequence into the stone with dynamic, muscular tension. You can see the ranks of demons and gods leaning back, pulling the serpent. The galleries are heavily guarded by these carved naga serpents and protective kala faces.
Which are the monstrous jawless faces meant to ward off evil. And as a final detail, the central towers, carved from that specialized Mount Meru sandstone, actually change color as they reflect the light during sunset. They shift from gray to a warm, glowing gold. When you combine the visual effect, the astronomical alignments, the funerary flow, and the sheer tonnage of the stone, it is highly calculated. It is like building an artificial mountain, but engineering it with the internal precision of a Swiss watch.
It is the absolute pinnacle of their technical and artistic capabilities regarding stone. But here we must introduce a crucial reality check.
Okay, what is that?
While the stone temples house the gods and map the stars, a civilization of up to 1 million people cannot eat sandstone. They cannot green cosmology. The Khmer Empire existed in a harsh environmental reality, subjected to heavy tropical monsoons followed by intense baking dry seasons.
So while they were engineering the heavens, they also had to completely engineer the earth.
They did.
This civilization managed an extensive water management system that is, in terms of sheer survival, far more substantial than the stone temples. The terminology here is specific, and it delineates function. The sources detail the construction of barays, sras, and a vast network of canals.
The distinction between the barays and the sras highlights the dual nature of water in Khmer society, the spiritual and the practical.
Let's start with the sras.
The sras were localized temple ponds. They were relatively small, excavated directly into the temple precincts, and lined with steps. These were ceremonial. You would have stepped access for priests and bathers to perform spiritual cleansing, ritual ablutions, and to collect holy water for ceremonies.
But a sra is not keeping 1 million people alive during a drought. That job belonged to the barays. A baray is a monumental artificial reservoir used strictly for macro irrigation. The sheer scale of the barays is staggering. The West Baray, which was completed in the 12th century, measures 8 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide. It held millions upon millions of cubic meters of water.
And the method of construction for a baray is vital to understand. Unlike modern reservoirs, which are often created by finding a natural valley and building a dam across a river to flood the depression, the Khmer lived on a flat floodplain.
You can't dam a flat plain.
Exactly. So they constructed the barays by building massive, towering earthen embankments dikes directly on the flat ground. They moved millions of tons of earth to build these rectangular walls, creating a massive raised bowl that caught and stored the torrential monsoon rains falling directly from the sky, as well as diverting water from natural rivers.
This earth-based hydraulic infrastructure allowed them to control the water flow year-round. It is a massive gravity battery for water. By capturing the monsoon rains within these high embankments, they elevated the water above the level of the surrounding fields.
Right.
Then, using a highly calculated gravity-fed distribution system via the canal network, they could open the sluice gates and irrigate the rice paddies continuously throughout the brutal dry season.
And that absolute control over water was the economic foundation of the entire empire. This hydraulic mastery enabled intensive year-round rice agriculture. They were yielding 3 or 4 harvests a year, while neighboring regions yielded 1.
That is a massive surplus.
That surplus of food is what supported the massive urban and rural population, estimated to have reached up to 1 million people at its height.
But the genius of the Khmer approach is that they rarely separated function from belief. The berets were entirely practical, secular feats of civil engineering designed to sustain life. Yet, they simultaneously reinforced the Temple Mountain symbolism, the massive rectangular lakes acting as the physical manifestation of the cosmic oceans surrounding the central temples.
The ideology was woven into the utility.
It begs a logistical question, though. Hold on, I'm trying to picture the logistics of the workforce here. You have master sculptors doing microscopic alignments for the equinox at the temples, but you also have people digging a literal 8-kilometer lake. Did the architects who designed the precise astronomical alignments of the stone temples also engineer the earthen embankments of the berets? Or was there a strict separation between the spiritual builders, the priests and stonemasons, and the civil engineers who managed the dirt and water of the empire?
It is highly probable that the design and execution were entirely integrated at the highest levels of the royal administration. In the Khmer worldview, the cosmology and the agriculture were not separate domains. The king, as the Devaraja, was singularly responsible for both the spiritual harmony of the universe and the physical prosperity of the land. The temple that pleased the gods and the reservoir that fed the peasants were two halves of the exact same royal obligation.
So the chief architect of the king would view the reservoir and the temple as one cohesive machine.
Exactly. However, the labor forces on the ground would have been highly specialized. You had elite guilds of master stonemasons and sculptors working on the sandstone shrines. Meanwhile, the earth moving for the berets was likely accomplished through massive corvée labor gangs.
Wait, so this wasn't a construction crew being paid daily wages? This was a system where citizens owed their physical labor to the king as a form of taxation, right?
Yes, corvée labor is a form of unpaid mandatory labor, exacted by a state in lieu of monetary taxes. The king commanded the agricultural calendar, and during the dry season when there was less immediate farming to do, thousands of citizens were drafted to move earth, dig canals, and maintain the embankments.
That is substantial.
The survival of the entire network relied on this massive, tightly coordinated human effort.
But relying on such a massive, interconnected, gravity-fed system creates severe vulnerabilities. If the entire network relies on the gentle, natural slope of the land to push water from an 8-kilometer reservoir down into thousands of acres of rice paddies, any slight disruption is catastrophic. A 1-degree change in elevation or a blockage in a main artery could starve an entire region of water.
And that vulnerability is exactly what caught up to them. The reliance on this specific hydraulic system eventually led to a severe ecological collapse. The mechanism of this failure is a classic case of overextending environmental resources.
Walk us through the mechanism of that collapse. How exactly did it fail?
Over centuries, the population grew. To feed that growing population, the demand for agricultural land increased. This led to widespread aggressive deforestation upriver and around the Kulin Hills to clear more land for rice paddies.
They cut down the trees to plant more food.
Yes, but the trees were performing a critical, unseen function. Their root systems were holding the topsoil together. Without the forest to bind the earth, the intense torrential downpours of the monsoon season hit bare dirt.
Oh, I see where this is going.
The water carved massive gullies, turning into mudslides and washing thousands of tons of loose sediment directly into the river network and the meticulously carved canals.
So the canals choke on the mud.
Exactly. Heavy siltation. The bottom of the canals filled up with dirt, which disrupted the delicate gravity gradient required to move the water. As the network clogged, they couldn't distribute the water from the berets to the fields. The crops failed.
And when the crops fail?
When the crops fail, the people starve, and they can no longer perform the corvée labor required to dredge the canals. It's a devastating negative feedback loop. This environmental degradation and total system failure was a major contributing factor to the eventual decline of Angkor as a political and population center.
But before the canals fully choked and the environment collapsed, the empire experienced a massive, sudden political shock. Following a long period of relative stability, the Khmer Empire faced a devastating invasion in the year 1177 by the neighboring Cham people, who sailed up the lake and sacked the capital.
A huge disruption.
This catastrophic event prompted the next ruler to fundamentally alter both the defensive architecture and the religious focus of the entire civilization.
The ruler who emerged from the chaos of this crisis was King Jayavarman VII. The sacking of the capital deeply traumatized the state. For centuries, they had built these massive temple mountains dedicated to Shiva and Vishnu. The kings had declared themselves gods on earth, and yet the capital burned.
Right, the old gods didn't protect them.
The Hindu gods, it seemed to the population, had failed to protect the empire. When Jayavarman VII consolidated power and took the throne, he recognized that a fundamental reset was required. He initiated a massive building campaign, constructing a heavily fortified, new walled city called Angkor Wat, and at its exact center, his new state temple, the Bayon.
And with this new construction came a profound religious pivot. Jayavarman VII shifted the state religion away from Hinduism and officially embraced Mahayana Buddhism. This ideological shift is heavily physically reflected in the architecture of the Bayon.
It looks completely different.
The Bayon style represents the absolute peak of architectural complexity, but it feels entirely different from what came before. It does not have the strict, open symmetry, the sweeping causeways, or the clean lines of Angkor Wat. Instead, it is a dense, claustrophobic, almost overwhelming structure.
The spatial experience of the Bayon is radically different. It feels like a compressed forest of stone. The outer galleries of the Bayon stretch for 1.2 kilometers, and they are adorned with over 11,000 intricately carved figures. But what marks a highly significant departure here is the subject matter of those bas-reliefs.
Right, because at Angkor Wat we saw the churning of the ocean of milk, we saw gods and demons and mythic battles. What are they carving at the Bayon?
They are carving reality. The reliefs of the Bayon depict the actual everyday life of 13th century Khmer society.
Just everyday people.
Yes. You see vivid, chaotic scenes of local markets with merchants weighing goods. You see intense naval battles against the Cham forces on the Tonle Sap Lake, with warriors falling into the water to be eaten by crocodiles. You see people cooking pigs over fires, men playing board games, and women giving birth. It's an unparalleled historical document, shifting the focus from the celestial myths down to the gritty human experience of the empire.
It is like the king decided to put the citizens themselves on the walls of the temple. But while the lower galleries focus on the human realm, the upper levels of the Bayon are dominated by something entirely otherworldly. The most striking, unforgettable feature of the Bayon is the towers.
The stone faces.
The temple integrates over 200 massive, enigmatic stone faces carved directly into the four sides of the structural towers, looking out in the cardinal directions. These faces, with their serene, closed-eyed smiles, dominate the entire structure.
When you climb to the upper terrace and walk through the dense cluster of these towers, the sheer density of these faces creates an omnipresent gaze. No matter where you stand, no matter which direction you turn, you are constantly being watched by these serene, massive expressions. It fundamentally alters the psychological experience of the architecture. You are no longer just looking at a monument. The monument is looking at you.
The identity of these faces is heavily debated, isn't it?
It is one of the great mysteries of Khmer art. Officially, reflecting the new Mahayana Buddhist focus of the state, they are widely considered to represent the bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara.
Can you clarify what a bodhisattva is?
A bodhisattva is an enlightened being who delays their own nirvana out of pure compassion, choosing to remain in the world to help others achieve salvation. The four faces, looking in all directions, symbolize this boundless, all-encompassing compassion radiating toward all corners of the empire.
However, a lot of scholars point out a very convenient coincidence. The faces bear a striking, undeniable physical resemblance to the surviving portrait statues of King Jayavarman VII himself.
Yes, they really do. And this suggests a deliberate, highly pragmatic blending of concepts. He was merging the Buddha's universal compassion with his own royal, omnipresent authority. He was watching over his people, both as a spiritual savior and as an absolute monarch.
So basically, Jayavarman VII built the ancient equivalent of putting his own face on 1,000 stone billboards in the center of the city, just to make absolutely sure everyone knew who was in charge and who saved them from the invasion.
That is one way to look at it.
But what is truly fascinating about his approach is that he did not violently erase the past. When he shifted the empire to Buddhism, he didn't send gangs out to smash the Hindu temples. He wove existing Hindu symbolism, like the naga serpents and the mythic motifs, seamlessly into his new Mahayana Buddhist framework. It is as if the Bayon is a massive stone tapestry where a new ruler decided to weave his new religion directly over the old one, utilizing the exact same threads rather than tearing the old fabric down entirely.
That process is called syncretism, the merging of different beliefs and schools of thought. It's a highly pragmatic move. By absorbing the old, familiar Hindu symbols into the new Buddhist theology, he maintained cultural continuity and political legitimacy.
Right, he kept the peace.
He didn't alienate the population or the established priesthood. He simply redirected them. He utilized the established architectural vocabulary that the people already revered to communicate an entirely new cosmic order.
The Bayon and Angkor Wat are monumental, and their stone faces have survived the centuries. But we have to remember a glaring fact. The vast majority of the Khmer population, that estimated 1 million people, did not live in stone temples.
They certainly did not.
They lived their daily lives in structures made of materials that have long since returned to the earth. The vernacular architecture, the lived experience of the ordinary citizen, tells an entirely different, incredibly practical story.
The traditional rural Khmer house was built entirely of perishable, locally sourced organic materials. The builders utilized wooden frames hewn from the jungle, walls made of tightly woven bamboo panels, and thatched roofs constructed from layered palm leaves or dried grass. These materials were abundant, rapidly renewable, and perfectly suited to the specific demands of the environment.
The dimensions of these homes were modest, typically ranging from 4 by 6 meters to 6 by 10 meters, and they were usually partitioned into 3 small rooms. But the defining, non-negotiable characteristic of Khmer domestic architecture is the elevation. These houses were built on stilts, raising the primary living floor up to 3 meters off the bare ground.
The stilt design is an incredibly effective, multi-layered environmental adaptation. First and foremost, elevating the structure provided immediate protection from the massive annual floodwaters. When the monsoon arrived and the lake expanded, the ground turned to mud or was submerged entirely.
So the stilts kept the living quarters dry.
Exactly. Secondly, it kept the inhabitants safe from wild animals, tigers, and the numerous venomous snakes that populate the region.
And it essentially acts as a primitive air conditioning system, right?
Yes. Raising the floor allowed the prevailing winds to circulate entirely beneath and through the porous bamboo walls, providing vital, constant ventilation in a fiercely hot and humid tropical climate.
It also created a highly functional secondary space. The shaded area beneath the elevated floorboards was not just dead space. It was utilized as the primary daytime workspace. Families would store their heavy agricultural tools, operate heavy wooden rice mills, and keep their livestock, pigs, chickens, water buffalo penned under the house, protected from the baking sun and the driving rain.
It was the center of daily activity.
Access to the main elevated living area was achieved using wooden ladders or steep ramps, which could be pulled up at night. They also utilized different roof shapes to rapidly shed the heavy rain, including the steep gabled roof, the hipped roof, and the bonnet roof.
While the physical houses are gone, the archaeological record, specifically post holes left in the earth, and the detailed bas-reliefs at the Bayon, give us a very clear picture of how these houses were organized into communities. In the 12th century urban grid surrounding the temples of Angkor, you would have found dense, organized clusters of these stilted wooden houses sitting on artificially elevated earth mounds.
They built mounds to get even higher above the floodwaters.
Yes, and these mounds were strategically positioned near the rice fields and directly along the vast canal networks. The open plan of the houses, without heavy stone walls separating neighbors and their tight clustering in villages, facilitated the intense communal labor and communication required for maintaining the wet rice agriculture and the corvée labor system we discussed earlier.
There is a deep, unpretentious, practical wisdom here. Sandstone is the perfect material for an eternal monument to the gods, but a raised wooden house with woven bamboo walls that lets the breeze blow right through it is infinitely more comfortable and practical for surviving a tropical monsoon.
They used the right materials for the job.
You also had communities adapting even further by abandoning land altogether, building floating wooden houses directly on the surface of the Tonle Sap Lake, rising and falling dynamically with the massive seasonal changes in water levels.
The strict reliance on wood and thatch for domestic architecture perfectly explains why the urban centers of the Khmer Empire appear to us today as isolated stone temples standing alone in the jungle. The residential neighborhoods, the bustling markets, the sprawling wooden palaces of the kings themselves, all built of organic materials, decayed rapidly, and were reclaimed by the jungle once the city was eventually abandoned.
Leaving only the laterite and sandstone monuments behind as skeletal markers of a vanished metropolis.
Exactly.
That abandonment marks a major permanent transition in the story of this architecture. When the canal systems failed and the centralized power at Angkor collapsed in the early 15th century, specifically marked by the fall of the capital to the invading Ayutthaya kingdom in 1431, the massive stone building projects stopped. But this did not mean the end of Khmer architecture. Rather, it triggered an era of deep adaptation and hybridity. Often we hear this post-Angkorian era described simply as a decline.
Following 1431, the political center of gravity shifted south, migrating away from the failing hydraulic networks of Angkor toward the river confluences near modern-day Phnom Penh. Accompanying this political and geographical shift was a final, permanent religious shift. The population largely adopted Theravada Buddhism, which remains the dominant religion today.
And Theravada Buddhism fundamentally changes the architectural requirements, doesn't it?
Completely. Unlike the Devaraja cult of the god kings, or the expansive Mahayana Buddhism of Jayavarman VII, Theravada Buddhism is focused on personal spiritual effort, monastic discipline, and the teachings of the historical Buddha.
So it's much more localized.
Yes. It did not require massive, centralized royal temple mountains reaching to the sky to legitimize a king. It favored smaller, localized, decentralized monastic communities.
So the architecture adapted to this new reality. Without the massive wealth of the Angkorian kings or the corvée labor gangs to move millions of tons of sandstone, they began building smaller wats, or local temples. They used recycled materials, scavenging bricks, and smaller laterite blocks from older ruined sites.
Which is very resourceful.
They also heavily incorporated structural and decorative Siamese influences from the conquering Ayutthaya kingdom, reflecting the complex political dynamics and the cross-pollination of the era. We see a definitive shift away from the grand, eternal sandstone monuments toward practical structures made of wood and brick that prioritize immediate functionality for local monks and traveling pilgrims.
This era is indeed often characterized by historians as a period of architectural decline, primarily because they're measuring it strictly against the sheer tonnage, the intricate stone carving, and the massive scale of Angkor Wat. If your metric for success is a 60-meter stone pyramid, then yes, smaller wooden wats appear as a decline.
But that's a limited way to look at it.
It is. As you look closely at the structures and the historical context, you see an incredible resilience and an evolution in building techniques. They were adapting the old traditional forms to serve a new theology, using whatever limited resources were available in a fractured political landscape.
I would firmly push back on the label of decline for this post-Angkorian period. Is it really accurate to call it a decline, or is it much more accurate to view this era as a highly pragmatic survival strategy? The builders adapted to new political realities, a new religion, and a lack of forced labor by using whatever materials and regional influences were at hand to keep their culture functioning.
It is absolutely a survival strategy, and a highly successful one. Architecture must serve the needs of its specific time. The need for a 50-meter-high sandstone pyramid to house a god king simply no longer existed. The need for a practical community gathering space for monks did. The building tradition did not die. It merely changed form to survive. Yep. And that remarkable capacity for adaptation becomes even more pronounced when we move forward into the late 19th and early 20th centuries during the French colonial period.
In the 1860s, under King Norodom I, we see the construction of the royal palace complex in Phnom Penh. This introduces a fascinating, almost jarring fusion of styles. French colonial architects brought European industrial materials and neoclassical sensibilities, which collided directly with traditional Khmer forms. The most striking visual example of this collision is the Napoleon III Pavilion, erected on the palace grounds in 1876.
The Napoleon III Pavilion is a perfect architectural time capsule of colonial hybridity. It was actually given as a gift by the French emperor. You have a structure built entirely with imported, prefabricated cast-iron columns and a rigid neoclassical European facade.
But the roof is different.
Yes. It is topped with traditional sweeping Khmer gilded roofs and steep prasat towers. It physically merges the cold industrial materials of 19th century Europe with the warm royal iconography of Cambodia. It is a building that wears two distinct identities at once.
And that profound drive to synthesize the past with the present, the traditional with the modern, continued forcefully into the post-independence era. In the 1960s, after Cambodia gained independence, a bold new movement known as New Khmer Architecture emerged, led primarily by the visionary Western-educated architect Van Mulliven.
His work is highly significant.
He sought to assert a modern, forward-looking Cambodian identity by taking the ancient Angkorian motifs and executing them using modern engineering specifically, utilizing the plasticity and strength of reinforced concrete.
Van Mulliven did not just copy the look of the old temples, he studied the ancient sites deeply to understand how they functioned. He understood perfectly how the Khmer ancestors used water to stabilize ground, how they used elevation to manage floods, and how they manipulated airflow for cooling.
He brought those ideas into the modern era.
He took those fundamental thousand-year-old concepts, the expansive moats, the stilted elevations for ventilation, the protective naga balustrades, and applied them directly to mid-century modernism. He used the durability and the structural freedom of reinforced concrete to evoke the monumental scale and the heavy mass of Angkor, but without the immense crushing corvée labor required to quarry sandstone.
The Olympic National Sports Complex in Phnom Penh, built in 1964, is widely considered the absolute masterpiece of this movement. It was a massive civic project designed to hold 50,000 spectators. Malivan incorporated massive concrete moats into the design of the stadium. Now, these moats were not just decorative throwbacks. They were engineered to manage the intense monsoon runoff and prevent the complex from flooding, deliberately and functionally echoing the hydraulic engineering of Angkor Wat.
It was a very practical homage.
He blended the functional, acoustic, and spatial needs of a 20th century sports arena with the thousand-year-old heritage of the land.
It brilliantly demonstrates that the core underlying principles of Khmer architecture, managing heavy water, elevating structures above the mud, and integrating large buildings harmoniously into the demanding tropical landscape, are just as relevant and necessary in the 20th century as they were in the 12th century. The materials changed drastically, from laterite and wood to cast iron and reinforced concrete, but the brutal environmental challenges remained exactly the same.
Today, the physical legacy of all these varied architectural phases, the early fired brick towers, the towering sandstone mountains, the wooden stilt houses, the post-Angkorian Wats, and the concrete stadiums of the 60s, is concentrated in a landscape that requires a massive, coordinated international effort to simply keep it standing against the ravages of time, water, and human activity.
Following the political stabilization of the country in the early 1990s, the international community recognized the urgent need to rally and preserve the Angkor site, which had suffered from decades of neglect, war, and looting. In 1993, following the Tokyo Declaration, a unique body was established, the International Coordinating Committee for the Safeguarding and Development of the Historic Site of Angkor.
This is widely known as the ICC Angkor.
Yes, it operates with heavy UNESCO support. It is co-chaired by France and Japan, and it works in direct, daily partnership with the Cambodian Apsara National Authority.
The physical scale of what the ICC Angkor is trying to protect is immense. We aren't talking about putting a fence around a single building. The protected zone covers 401 square kilometers, which is approximately 40,000 hectares. It is not just one or two temples, it is an entire sprawling forested landscape dotted with massive stone structures, ancient fragile hydraulic works, and countless buried archaeological sites.
Managing a site of this magnitude involves an incredibly delicate balancing act. They must deploy state-of-the-art archaeological conservation while simultaneously managing complex, highly sensitive socioeconomic realities. The ICC Angkor has to analyze and actively mitigate two distinct, massive types of pressure currently threatening the structural integrity of the site.
The first is what we categorize as endogenous pressure.
Right.
Let's define endogenous pressure. This comes from inside the designated zone. The archaeological park is not empty. There is a local active population of over 100,000 people living across 112 specific villages scattered directly within the protected site. These are families who have lived there for generations, tracing their lineage back through the centuries.
And our presence matters.
Naturally, as these populations grow, they seek to build new homes, expand their agriculture, raise cattle, and extend their living space. This daily, necessary human activity puts constant, unavoidable pressure on the fragile archaeological remains buried just inches beneath the surface of the soil.
You cannot simply freeze a landscape of this size in amber when 100,000 people rely on it for their daily livelihood and survival. The conservation efforts must respect their right to exist there. Then, on top of that, you have the exogenous pressure, which comes aggressively from outside the zone. The neighboring city of Siem Reap has experienced massive, rapid urban sprawl, largely driven by the explosion of global tourism. You have millions of international visitors arriving annually, requiring massive infrastructure hotels, wider roads, increased water usage, waste management, and electricity. This creeping, heavy urban development threatens to severely encroach upon and disrupt the demarcated eco-historical areas.
It creates a highly unique tension in the world of conservation. We often think of World Heritage Sites as closed-off, sterile, glass-case museums where you buy a ticket, walk a designated paved path, take a photo, and leave before the gates lock.
But that's not Angkor.
Angkor is a living, breathing landscape. You have 100,000 people waking up, cooking breakfast over fires, and going to work every single day among thousand-year-old temples. The conservation effort has to ensure that the local population actually benefits from the site's sustainable development through employment, infrastructure, and education, without degrading the authenticity and the physical, structural integrity of the monuments themselves.
The primary goal of the ICC Angkor is to weave those competing needs together harmoniously. To do this, they utilize highly advanced, non-invasive techniques. They use LiDAR laser scanning to map the hidden structures beneath the jungle canopy without cutting trees. They use complex material analysis to understand how to stabilize crumbling sandstone and degrading laterite without using damaging modern cements. But simultaneously, they are developing community-supported projects, vocational training in traditional crafts, and sustainable tourism models that distribute the economic benefits. The ultimate survival of the architecture today depends entirely on the harmony of the society living around it, just as it did when the berries were built in the 12th century.
Which leaves us with a compelling, almost philosophical thought regarding the cyclical nature of architectural materials in time. When we look at the ruins of the Khmer Empire today, we rightfully revere the laterite foundations and the perfectly fitted, mortarless sandstone blocks as the absolute pinnacle of their era's technology, perfectly applied to the severe environmental challenges of the Cambodian landscape. But consider the long future. Thousands of years from now, when the jungle reclaims the modern world, how might future archaeologists view the ruins of the 1960s New Khmer architecture? Will they excavate the crumbling, reinforced concrete stilts and the dried-out concrete moats of Van Malavan's Olympic sports complex and view them with that exact same reverence? Will they recognize that 20th century builders were trying to solve the exact same eternal problems of water, heat, and gravity using the absolute peak technology of their own time? Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.